How the Janitor saved Nintendo just days from failing. Nintendo was one of the most popular brands in the world and the third most valuable company in Japan. Nintendo currently sits at more than $95 billion in net worth. But did you know that Nintendo was never meant to be a family-friendly video game company? So, how did it become the world's best-selling video game system? In this video, we are going to learn how Nintendo became successful and how on its journey, it became just days from collapsing before eventually being saved by a janitor, all on its way to becoming one of the most loved and best-selling consoles ever. The company was popular for always taking risks and making bold decisions. But how far could they go? And how did the janitor save Nintendo just days from failing? Let's find out. But before we share this unlikely story, please subscribe to watch other stories like this as soon as they come out. Nintendo's first gamble. In the 16th century, Western-style playing cards became a popular pastime among locals and were often used to gamble in Japan. They were later banned when Japan closed its borders to the world, but in the 19th century, the ban was finally lifted. Afterwards, it was no longer seen as exciting as before, but still, an artist named Fushizuro Yamauchi saw an opportunity, and he believed they could become popular again, since they were used for different games. He started working on his idea, and he called the venture Nintendo Koppai, which became the biggest playing card manufacturer in Japan within the decade. When he retired, he handed the business over to his daughter's husband, Sekiro Kaneda. Sekiro proved to be a worthy successor after creating a distribution system and sales force all over Japan. But as the business grew, the Yamauchi family fell apart, proving there are some things money can't buy. When his grandson became 21, he offered to take over the family business, and Hiroshi reluctantly agreed and became Nintendo Koppai's new president overnight. But soon, he realized that it was difficult to expand it, so he dropped Koppai from the company name and took it public to finance its expansion. Saved by a janitor. After going public, he launched an instant rice product, started a taxi company, and opened a love hotel. While all of these ventures brought in some revenue, Nintendo lost a fortune and sunk into debt. As Hiroshi started to think about potential new business ventures, but continued his family's business, Nintendo Koppai. As the company sunk deeper into debt, a worker that had been at Nintendo for about 5 years doing various jobs, including being a janitor, had started tinkering around, using his imagination to make his own games. One day, Gunpei cut crisscrossing pieces of wood and put them together. Afterwards, he added a group of colored balls that would be grabbed and called it Ultra Hand. When Hiroshi saw his new invention, Hiroshi asked him to turn his invention into Nintendo's first game. This game was a commercial success, and Nintendo sold over 1 million units. Over the next decade, Gunpei developed more games, including the Love Tester and Beam Gun series, that were so successful in Japan. Short-lived successes. After 2 years, Nintendo launched its first video game console, the Color TV game, and they brought in millions. After that, Nintendo launched the Game & Watch series, its first handheld video game console the size of calculators. The company hoped to sell at least 100,000 units, but they sold 600,000 in the first year and couldn't keep up with the international demand. After the great success, they worked on expanding the series, and Hiroshi set his eyes on a new goal that was breaking into arcade games. For this, he chose his son-in-law, Minoru, and Minoru's first task as Nintendo of America's president was to break into the arcade business. So he and his wife moved to New York to set up the company's headquarters and hire a sales team. In the beginning, they were able to sell Nintendo's first arcade game, Space Fever, in bars, restaurants, and bowling alleys. Their next game, Radar Scope, was considered old and boring, and few businesses were interested in buying it. Neither of them would have ever imagined Radar Scope's failure would lead to Nintendo's first big hit, and it was all thanks to a designer who had never made a game before. The making of Donkey Kong and Mario. 3 years later, Nintendo offered one of its engineers, Shigeru, an opportunity to make a new game. Shigeru had never made a game before, but inspired by Beauty and the Beast and King Kong, he came up with a story where a man must save his girlfriend from his pet ape. As for the game's title, Shigeru chose Donkey Kong, since the ape was goofy like a carpenter. When Nintendo of America's team heard about the game, they were shocked, but they launched it. When Donkey Kong launched, every single shipment sold, and it became Nintendo's first big hit overnight, and brought in millions of dollars, saving Nintendo's legacy. After that, Nintendo released its new console, the family computer dubbed the Famicom. Just as Hiroshi predicted, it flew off the shelves and brought in more money than he had ever seen before. However, the video game market had crashed due to a flood of terrible games, and companies like Atari were going bankrupt. So Minoru advised Hiroshi to add a remote control and keyboard, and also renamed it to Advanced Video System. 1 year later, the AVSs launched at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show, but it was a big failure. When he rebranded the AVS as an all-in-one entertainment center, he renamed it the Nintendo Entertainment System. 1 year later, the NES launched at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show, but attendees were still reluctant to place orders. A bold suggestion changed the whole story. After that, Hiroshi advised Minoru to sell the NES in the most challenging city to start in, New York. After settling into the city, Minoru met different people to sell his game, but they weren't interested. So Minoru changed his strategy and offered a risk-free proposal, allowing them to return any unsold products. But still, the sales were slow, so he reached out to his former neighbor, Peter, who was a restaurant executive, for help. Minoru convinced him to join Nintendo. Then Peter met with Wall Street analysts to pitch Nintendo, but not a single analyst knew anything about Nintendo until Peter sat with them. Soon after, the Wall Street analysts started telling retailers about Nintendo. More retailers started carrying Nintendo's products, and some increased their orders. Afterward, the NES became the top-selling toy in the country, and more than 7 million units were sold along with 33 million games. But yet again, success brought on new problems. A chip shortage hit the US and the rest of the world. It became so severe that only a handful of companies survived unscathed, and Nintendo wasn't an exception. From shortage to innovation. When the NES took off, Nintendo struggled to meet the demand for its products, as its hardware units and games required various chips that were scarce from the global shortage. Fortunately, one of Nintendo's engineers came up with a new game called the Game Boy, but it needed a particular game to drive sales, and that was Tetris. At the time, the Soviet Union owned Tetris. Andromeda Software was the only company that was given the rights. Andromeda contracted Microsoft to produce the game in the UK, and Microsoft contracted Atari to create a console version. When Nintendo's lawyers tried to negotiate for the console rights, they had a hunch that Andromeda, Microsoft, and Atari didn't actually have them. Then, Hiroshi and Minoru sent an emissary to Moscow, so that they chose Hank Rogers for this task. Hank was a young game designer who made a version of Go for Nintendo. Over time, he became one of the few people who became close with Hiroshi. He didn't have any connections in Moscow and couldn't speak Russian, but knew how to find his way in the middle of any storm. After arriving in Moscow, he discovered that Nintendo's suspicions were right. The Soviet Union had yet to give any company the console rights to Tetris, and Andromeda was only given the PC rights. Later, Hank met Alexei, who developed Tetris while working, and then Alexei convinced the Soviet Union officials to give Nintendo the console rights to Tetris. 2 months later, the Game Boy and Tetris bundle was released. It sold out within 2 weeks, and within 3 years, Nintendo's net sales jumped from $2.3 billion to $5.2 billion. World's best-selling video game. In the following decades, Nintendo was recognized as launching some of the world's greatest consoles, including the Game Boy, Nintendo 64, GameCube, Nintendo DS, the Wii, and Nintendo Switch. It was also remembered as launching some of the world's best-selling video game franchises, including Donkey Kong, Mario, Pokemon, Super Smash Bros., Legend of Zelda, and Animal Crossing. And amid the coronavirus pandemic, Nintendo became the richest company in Japan. Profits soared by more than 400%. In a Washington Post article, writer John Irwin highlights one of Nintendo's biggest keys to survival. This is the story of how Nintendo became successful. What is your opinion about this whole story? Let us know in the comment box. For more inspiring stories about today's most successful brands, don't forget to subscribe to our channel.